Welcome back to part 2 of The Pension Detective. Today's pension is Christopher Eaton. Where we left off was Christopher had joined the 2nd North Carolina Regiment, had marched up north, had been inoculated against smallpox, and now they are getting ready to go into battle for the very first time. When the North Carolina Continentals, with Christopher Eaton, joined Washington's army, things began to move fast. Within just a few weeks, the British had sailed most of their army away from New York and were heading somewhere to defeat the Continentals. Where they were heading was a mystery, and Washington had intelligence agents everywhere. Washington had a really good intelligence network. They were out there trying to find out if the British were heading to the Carolinas again, or were they sailing up to Boston once more. But the most likely destination was Philadelphia, because that's where the leaders of the rebellion were all gathered in Congress. The North Carolina regiments were scattered all across Pennsylvania and Trenton, and Washington gathered them all in one spot for the first time. They rendezvoused in their old camp in the Schuylkill River. Some of the men had different colored coats, and they were the lucky ones who had been issued the uniforms as they arrived from Congress. Unfortunately for Christian, these coats were issued to the troops 6 months before he had enlisted. So all he got was a white hunting frock, but it worked well enough. Now Washington soon discovered the British plans, and sure enough, their target was Philadelphia. They had landed at Head of Elk, Maryland, with a massive force of men, artillery, and cavalry. A force was quickly made up fast to go and intercept these guys. This was hand-picked battalion of light infantry made up of men from each of the state's regiments. Normally, the light infantry would have been Daniel Morgan's riflemen, but Morgan had been sent north to support General Horatio Gates at Saratoga. The new light infantry force was under the command of General William Maxwell. The 2nd North Carolina's own Colonel Alexander Martin would command the North Carolina Company of this light infantry force. Many of the men chosen were armed with rifles. The North Carolinians had a mix. They didn't really have all muskets yet. Not all the soldiers of the North Carolina Continentals were issued muskets and bayonets yet. Christian was not part of this light infantry force, so he was placed under the North Carolinians with Washington's main element at Red Clay Creek. Now, Maxwell's light infantry force must have been doing well, because a British camp follower had deserted their army and told them that there were 9 wagons of wounded British that had to be sent to Head of Elk to recover just because of the damage that they had done. Christian was awake at midnight and told to be ready to move. In the dark, the army marched off. One officer said it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. Marched to a cliff overlooking Brandywine Creek at a critical piece of ground where the British would have to cross, Chad's Ford. The North Carolinians under General Nash were placed behind the lines, guarding the cattle and making sure that the soldiers did not eat the apple orchards of the farmers. Washington did not want to make the local population enemy of his army because he needed them for his intelligence and supplies. Now, Washington did not want to be surprised, so he had the army traveling light with everything else placed in the baggage wagons ready to move. All the tents were struck and packed away, and even the soldiers' packs were put in the wagons. Now, this kind of concerned Christian, since everything he owned was in that pack. For 5 days, the men only had a single wool blanket each night. The men made brush arbors, a sort of tent made out of tree limbs and sticks to sleep in each night. Now, Washington also worried about the deadly effectiveness of the British professional soldier, so he ordered that the subalterns, the lower-ranking officers like ensigns and lieutenants, to be armed with muskets and bayonets instead of just walking around with a sword. They also ordered that the drummers and fifers be armed with muskets and do duties as soldiers. He didn't need guys out there tooting and banging on drums. He needed soldiers, because there was going to be a massive army he was going to fight. Now, Washington had been told by the local farmer that Chad's Ford was the only way across the Brandywine with artillery and wagons. Unfortunately, that's a lie. A huge problem was that Washington had no decent cavalry force, and he didn't have anybody that could ride out, investigate, and recon the area. So he had to rely on the words of the local farmers. What Washington didn't know was that the same farmers told the British force under General Howe that there was a crossing point farther north at a place called Jeffrey's Ford. The British began their march at about 5 o'clock in the morning to march all the way around the American lines. To make sure that they did not know about this, he created a diversion at Chad's Ford, where Washington's army was. He sent 6,000 provincials are Americans fighting for the British, and Hessians, to make a feint, a diversion at Chad's Ford, and conduct a massive artillery barrage. Now, Maxwell's light infantry were there to slow them down, but they were slowly pushed across the Brandywine. Christian watched all this from the apple orchard behind the lines. He could not see much, but he could hear when the artillery duel between the Hessians and Washington's artillery began. Many times the balls would just zip across the ground where he's located, still spinning until they came to a stop. The diversion worked. General Howe was able to get his 8,000 British regulars across the Brandywine and behind Washington's forces. He even had the men stop, take a break for lunch, like a picnic, while the British musicians played a serenade for them. When the British began to move, it ended up being a total rout. Washington tried to stop and form a new line, but it was only partially successful. The British were able to push through and almost surround Washington's entire army. Christian knew the fight was going badly. The artillery at Chath's Ford increased, and one officer described it as the balls plowing up the ground, the trees crackling over one's head, the branches riven by the artillery, the leaves falling as in autumn by the grape shot. Grape shot were like little 1-inch iron balls that fired out of a cannon, so it turned each cannon into a giant shotgun. Now, Washington tried to form a second line to stop the British, and it was made up of Sullivan's division. They too became surrounded and had to fight their way out. One unit, the 3rd Virginia Regiment, lost 81 men and 2 cannons, almost half of their strength. That's how bad it was. Washington withdrew and formed another line at a place that is today called Battle Hill. He left General Anthony Wayne in charge and then rode to General Greene's division. He ordered Greene to reinforce Sullivan's second line. Some of Wayne's men were unfamiliar with the bayonet, and a young 19-year-old French volunteer jumped off his horse and showed them how to fix bayonets on their muskets because they didn't quite understand how yet. This teenager was the Marquis de Lafayette. He volunteered to help Washington.
I'm in danger!
While Lafayette was there, he had a musket ball smash into his leg just below the knee. Soldiers helped him on his horse, and he rode to safety. While this was going on, Greene's division ran 4 miles. Think about that, 4 miles in crappy little shoes with buckles on them. They ran 4 miles in 45 minutes. That is actually pretty awesome if you think about it. They're carrying this big, long, heavy musket with a bayonet, crappy shoes, and they're able to do 4 miles in 45 minutes. Now, they arrived just in time to divert a total disaster. Greene's division was mainly Virginians, but he also had North Carolinians in reserve. Now, Christian and the rest of the North Carolinians formed on the edge of a cornfield near Sandy Hollow. The Virginians and Pennsylvanians were off to their right. The men were exhausted, having had to run that distance, and now they had to face the entire British army. Christian did not see the British approaching, but he could hear the cannons firing ever so fast. Greene's line was behind a hill in what is known as a reverse slope defense. He would not see the British until they were within point-blank range of the muskets as they came over the hill. When the British marched over the top of the hill, they were surprised to find Greene division waiting just 50 yards away. The volley was massive and killed 47 men and the officers of the 64th Regiment. The firing power of Greene's men was so intense that the British had to stop and move the artillery forward. They were able to get 2 6-pound cannons into position where they weren't fired on by muskets and then poured fire down onto the Virginians. The Virginians and North Carolinians fought for 45 minutes until the sun went down, and then Greene ordered the troops to withdraw. He did not do it all at once, but had them move back by platoons, firing a volley, then moving back 50 yards, and firing a volley and moving back 50 yards. Christian and the North Carolinians had moved to Dilworth's Crossroads, and they were told to hold the British back so the rest of the Continental Army could get away. A soldier of the 3rd Philadelphia Associators wrote, "Our way was over the dead and dying, and I saw many bodies crushed to pieces beneath the wagons. We were bespattered with blood. As we marched directly under the English cannon, we kept up a continual fire. The destruction of our men was very great." Christian had just survived the longest and bloodiest battle of the war, and for him, September 11th would be a day always remembered as one of death. Washington had lost over 1,000 men, almost all of his artillery. The British, meanwhile, had lost almost 600 men, but it was a victory for them. Philadelphia was abandoned by Congress, and the British occupied the capital of the newly created United States. Now, Washington's army retreated to Germantown, where he had his men supplied with more ammunition. He not only supplied ammunition, but now he ordered that an additional 40 rounds be carried by every soldier. Since a lot of the baggage had been captured at Brandywine, he also ordered now that 8 men would sleep to a tent. Normally, there would be 5 men to a tent, but there wasn't enough tents. Washington ordered all of the covering sergeants, these are soldiers who normally would not fire, to add their muskets to the firepower. He also gave the order that if any man attempted to run away in future battles, the officers are instantly to put him to death.
Shoot that guy.
The man does not deserve to live, who basely flies, breaks his solemn engagements, and betrays his country. Though this sounded like a deadly threat, Christian never saw anyone actually ever do this. Christian was assigned to a detail that left him out of the next big battle, just a month later at Germantown. Once again, Washington had been defeated when he tried to attack the British in a similar way that he used during the Battle of Trenton a year before. At Trenton, Washington had a small army, only about 1,000, and he could control them much easier. But this time, his army numbered in the thousands, and due to the complicated plan, many units arriving too late to make a difference, the weather also played against Washington, and a fog rolled in, making it even more chaotic. Washington had to withdraw, making the Battle of Germantown a loss. The good news to come out of this was that when the King of France heard about the victory of the Battle of Saratoga with General Gates, and then he heard about Washington's audacious attack just a month after suffering the greatest loss at Brandywine, the French king knew the Americans were dedicated. They were not going to back down. And maybe, just maybe, the Americans might beat the French lifelong rivals, the British. So France began to clandestinely supply the Americans with muskets and, most important, gunpowder. And this wraps up part 2 of The Pension Detective. Stay tuned for part 3, where we finish up the story of what happened to Christopher Eaton.